Hello and welcome to the seventh episode of Scroll Ideas. If you're new here, shame on you. But I'll still tell you about Scroll Ideas. It's a new show by Scroll where every episode we'll take an idea that Indians are discussing and debating, and we're going to break this down over the course of the next 1 hour. And we do this with a particularly brainy guest. The idea could be anything: law, politics, federalism, sports, food, drink, Nehru, Modi, uh, Gandhi, whatever. If the idea is interesting, the idea is worth discussing, debating, and having an adda over, we will do it. For this episode, we've got legal scholar and commentator Anuj Bhuwania, who I'm very pleased to have on the show. Anuj Bhuwania is a legal professor at the OP Jindal Global University, and he's also a legal commentator, and he's written a fantastic book called Quoting the People. It's around 5 years old now, and it's really a remarkable book. For me, it shaped the way I think about the intersection of law and politics in India, considering it's also part of my job as a journalist. Anuj Bhuwania does a history as well as takes a fairly critical look at the institution of the PIL, public interest litigation in India, which, remember, enjoys a sort of hallowed status in India as an epitome of an activist judiciary, as an example of direct justice. And Anuj Bhuwania takes a sort of critical look at that and looks under the hood and tells us that it's not everything that it seems, and there are a few problematic aspects to it. We'll come to the book, and throughout the rest of the episode, we'll also discuss the current state of the judiciary in India. Highly discussed, highly debated topic. Hi, Anuj. Welcome to
Hi,
Scroll
sir.
Ideas. Very pleased to have you.
Hi, Shoaib. Very glad to be here.
Anuj, like I said, we'll get to the book, but I want to first start off at the present moment. The judiciary is a hot topic of discussion. There's almost a consensus now amongst legal scholars and wonks that the judiciary is not doing its job of checking the executive. So a lot of people think that India is going through a period of democratic backsliding, and the obvious institution that could have checked that, or at least attempted to check that, was the judiciary. It's the judiciary's primary job to be a check on the executive constitutionally, according to not only India but across the democratic world. Except the judiciary has not done that. In fact, it's not even not done that, as you've written yourself a couple of years back, that it's actually acted as a powerful sword that can be wielded on behalf of the executive. Break this down for us. Why is it not doing its job, and how has it become a sword?
Yes, thank you for that question, Shoaib. Now, when we talk about the role of the court the role of judiciary in India, we assume a certain kind of normative role that a judiciary is supposed to function in any liberal democracy, right? Um, Now, and that is commonly understood as the function of a shield, as opposed to a sword, a shield in the hands of the people against the excesses of the legislature or the executive. In India, the judiciary has actually not performed that role in any significant manner for a long time now. Arguably, in my view, the high point of the courts performing that role. This is very counterintuitive in most people's imagination, I suppose. But in my view, it's actually the first 2.5 decades of Indian independence that actually the court tried to perform that role, at least.
Right.
Perhaps not adequately, but at least at least in many significant matters, they tried to act against against the governments of the day. And now
I think there was a big battle between the Nehruvian led executive and the state over, say, land reforms. Oh, sorry, the
absolutely.
judiciary over land reforms. Yeah, right.
Absolutely. That, of course, was the signature battle of that era. But there were a lot of other matters, even civil liberties matters, where the court, did actually try to push. Again, not adequately, like I said, but at least. So there was this
Relatively.
relatively. In fact, there's this article written 970 Economic and Political Weekly by the
Right.
scholar called George Gadbois, whose work is being recently, getting a revival. A much deserved revival, who did a kind of a study of the cases for the first 20 years of Indian independence,
Right.
then extant cases. And he actually found quite a significant share of the constitutional cases in the High Court, Supreme Court, going against the government, right?
Right.
which is quite remarkable. And if you
Especially
think about
remarkable where we are right now. But
exactly, now if
right.
somebody did a similar study for the last 8 years, I would be very surprised if anything like in any such proportion we will find the courts deciding against
Right.
the government. And I think this proposition of the court, of course, not acting as the shield, that's an omission, but it's also act of commission in the sense of actually acting to further the governmental agenda in ways inimical to its constitutional role. And the classic example of that is, of course, the NRC, right? What the court has done, which people often forget, perhaps, is that is an exercise which actually was initiated by the court. Of course, there was a demand for it among certain sections in Assam for a while, but the court actually initiated it in a matter, in a constitutional matter, which did not necessarily require it. It was actually a matter which is, I think, still pending, which required a constitutional interpretation, which the court has still not done. But in the meanwhile, it started this massive exercise costing, many millions of dollars, thousands of crores, actually, and which has led to radical consequences in that state and potentially, as we know, the rest of India as well. Yeah.
In fact, it started off as a PIL, right?
Exactly. Assam Public was, that's the name of the case. Yeah.
In fact, this is like, as you written in your book, this is a real feature of the PILs, that you could start off at one point and it could end off God knows where, right? I mean, like to order an exercise like that. And what is really interesting, I think, in NRC really is the state executive tried to do an NRC.
Yes.
It couldn't. Right?
Yes.
It's only the judiciary that, in a way, could push through such a draconian move.
Absolutely, it could steamroll all resistance in a manner that perhaps no other. And pursued it Justice Gogoi, who was heading that bench, pursued it. Single-mindedly, as you can see. I mean, it's very rare that a judge is responsible for a single case for so long, as he was, and he was obviously quite. I mean, I haven't read his autobiography, but presumably he does not. He would not try to hide his zeal with regard to that case, I would think.
Right. I've read it. It's recommended reading, Anuj.
Yes, I really should read it. I think court watchers should get a sense of reality by reading it. Yeah, I
think so. And this is something that you've written in an article a couple of years back, and which I again found very interesting. And I want to discuss for our viewers here is that. So there's, you've had democratic backsliding in other countries. You've had an unusual role of the judiciary in other countries. What is really unique in India, I think, as you put it, is that it's happened without actually any actual structural change. In fact, there have been no changes in personnel even, forget about structure. Right? There have been no changes. I mean, if a Martian came down and just read our legal text, he might not even see anything amiss unless he really immerses himself in the works of people such as yourself. How did the judiciary pull this off? Like, what are the internal mechanics of such a big change happening without any de jure change happening, or is there no big change and it was always this and we just didn't see?
Right. Now, this is an interesting question. I mean, I think what you're contrasting it to, and what I had mentioned also was contrasting it to, two well-known examples of such democratic backsliding, which is Erdogan's Turkey and Orban's Hungary, where they have directly attacked the courts and incumbent judges, and Poland as well now. And interestingly, also to counterpose it with Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, where also well-known attack on individual judges. Judges being transferred for doing their job, and judges being not confirmed. A lot of judges had to lose their position. High Court judges, that too, quite interesting. So not only the person, but also the powers of the judiciary. The infamous 42nd Amendment, which changed many provisions of the Constitution, was particularly also aimed at the judiciary at reducing the powers of judicial review. On the writ jurisdiction powers.
I think there was a big back and forth, a series of volleys, Golaknath to Kesavananda.
Yes.
Someone just read the legal text.
Yes.
They could understand that there's a
Yes.
Jamila happening, right?
Absolutely. No, there was no question that there was a war that
Right.
was that. At some level, the emergency. I'm just saying that the measures that Mrs. Gandhi took during the emergency with regard to judiciary, are quite analogous to what's been going on in Turkey and Hungary, for instance. So in that
Right.
sense, that the prior, now commonly thought to be authoritarian period in Indian history saw, in 75, between 75 and 77, saw an attack on the judiciary at various levels.
Right.
Now, interestingly, some people are calling the last 8 years a kind of undeclared emergency, etc. But one of the interesting things about it is precisely that absence. That the uh, executive does not seem to have any problem with the way the judiciary is functioning. Of course, it started with the well-known NJAC battle, where there was an attempted constitutional amendment. Shoaib, you've written about it quite a bit as well,
Right.
about an attempt to institutionalize um, a different process of judicial appointments. India has a strange system of judges appointing judges, theoretically, which is probably unique in the world, which was sought to be streamlined, but the court uh, in in a strange judgment, to put it mildly, struck it down. Um, but since then, it has made no difference clearly in terms of. I mean, it has in the sense that if so to say that judgment was an attempt to undermine executive interference in judicial functioning with regard to appointments, that has clearly not been on the contrary, it's been vice versa. So it's not like that collegium process has in any way stood in the path of executive involvement.
I
But
mean,
I
it
think,
almost seemed like a Pyrrhic loss, if I could invent a
yeah,
term.
yeah, I think that
So
may
it
be
was
an
good,
appropriate.
good match to lose for the government.
Yes,
Right.
yes, that's perhaps quite appropriate. But I think that is only one aspect of it with regard to the personnel, the appointments, right? The other is,
Right.
of course, that Mrs. Gandhi's attack was not just at the level of incumbent judges or removing particular people who were not sympathetic to her, etc., but also at the attack on the powers of the court. Mrs. Gandhi
Right.
was attacking directly what the court could do theoretically also under the constitutional regime. Many constitutional provisions for sought to be amended. Of course, they were undone after the emergency by the
Right.
Janta regime in the 44th Amendment. But it's an interesting thing to understand the thought behind that, because the judiciary at the time, by Mrs. Gandhi's regime, was famously thought as a kind of a obstacle to the reform, or to the changes to the socioeconomic changes that she wanted to bring about, such as they were. Now, clearly, the current regime does not see the judiciary as any such obstacle at all, right? It may well be an ally, and that's really interesting because the court, at some level, like you said, there's nothing changed. In fact, the court has acquired newer powers in the last few years. It's ever expanding arsenal of powers. I mean, the judiciary in India by design was a very particularly powerful court. It was envisaged, even if you read Granville Lofton's work, he's talking about in the chapter on judiciary that it was designed to be a powerful court, and its powers, got enhanced over a period of time by the well-known basic structure doctrine, etc. But interestingly, while those powers, like I said, in the first 25 years, were sought to be exercised in the classical function of being a check on the executive, etc., it's being exercised very differently in the last 4.5 decades. And those powers, such as they were, have been expanded, have expanded since then even further. And in the last 8 years, we have seen new doctrines like the doctrine of manifest arbitrariness, which was first the court basically propounded it in the triple talaq case. Justice
Could
Rohinton
you break
Nariman.
this down to us? What is that for our viewers?
Manifest arbitrariness. If the judiciary feels that a legislation um, seeks to do something which is manifestly arbitrary in the view of the judiciary, it can be struck on. Now, you can imagine how random this kind of
It's
doctrine
very
can be.
arbitrary.
Very arbitrary. In fact,
Doctrine,
uh,
right?
Alok Prasanna Kumar, well-known legal commentator, has called it
Right.
the arbitrariness of the arbitrary of the manifest arbitrariness in a critique of that. But that is his critique is a rare one relatively. It's not that. Unfortunately, the culture of critique around the judgments around in the judiciary in India is still about, if you don't like a particular judgment, you speak against it, but you do not understand that this kind of expansion of powers itself come with very, very serious dangers. So what we are doing, what does the doctrine mean? Basically, if the judiciary thinks any legislation is arbitrary, it can just strike it down straight away. Now, a similar doctrine had existed since the 70s, which is also quite a controversial one. Controversial not for everybody, but for court judiciary critics like Sirvai, H.M. Sirvai, the well-known constitutional scholar. But most people would not find it a problem, perhaps. Was to say that if an executive act was deemed to be arbitrary, it could be struck down. This was a judgment given by Justice Bhagwati in the mid 70s. That was expanded to not just executive action, but to all legislation. So this is as you can see, it's quite a radical expansion of powers, right? And this has happened during the last. This has happened in the last 3-4 years, and one would think that this is another example of the courts. Court becoming more powerful at some level, right? This idea of the Indian court being the most powerful judiciary in the world, which is often cited. You couldn't give. This is another example of it. Another kind of doctrine the court has increasingly started deploying is this idea of constitutional morality, that X goes against constitutional morality and can be struck down. Now, again, this is a profoundly vague formulation at best. Obviously, we all may have our individual views about X laws or X executive acts being against constitutional morality, but for the judiciary to just strike down a legislation based or it's quite a remarkable power to have. Now, this is again, you can see, and these are only new weapons that the court has got. The court has
it almost seems like the judiciary is giving itself legislative powers.
Well, so that's an interesting thing, right? So the court, it's an interesting hybrid beast we have right now, the court, because at some level it is not doing a judicial role, but it is performing more and more legislative roles as well as executive roles. But also, at some level, these kinds of powers of striking down legislation being arbitrary, of course, is a judicial. I mean, it's a remarkably expanded idea of judicial role, but it's still judicial at some level. But it is not. It's interesting how it is exercised. I mean, if you look at how clearly in the latest controversial case that has come, which has been written about in the last few days on the PMLA Act. Now, clearly, judges obviously don't think that is arbitrary, but that is what has happened, because if you have such a vague doctrine, right, where the it's judges may feel X law is not arbitrary and X law is arbitrary, triple talaq is arbitrary, and PMLA is not, etc. Right? So obviously, I mean, and they're entitled to the views. You may have your own views. I may have, but that is at the level it has reached. So
and just to give your viewers how arbitrary the PMLA is, in my view,
yes,
is that you are guilty before being held innocent. You can be arrested without being told what the charges are.
Absolutely.
Your property can be seized. So that did not fall afoul of the doctrine that Anuj just laid out. It's not manifestly arbitrary. Yeah.
Exactly. In my view, it's like it's an outrageous piece of legislation, but the court has written 500 pages to justify it. So what I'm going to say is that the powers of the court are there. So are there. Seemingly, they can do pretty much. They could. I mean, there's nothing stopping them theoretically in terms of their powers from acting against the government with regard to, or acting against the executive or the legislature. But clearly, it's not being exercised in that manner at all. And in my view, that is because the court in the last many decades has seen its normative role as a different one from what it saw in the first 25 years, or what is generally seen in the role in the case of a liberal democracy. It's not interested in performing the negative role, the defense, the role of the shield. It's interested in competing with the executive legislature, or in facilitating their powers in carrying out various purposes of the state.
In a way, you're saying that, like people who said that at the beginning of the Modi thing, that the court will check the executive, in a way that ignored actually the last 3 decades of the court's own history.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the benefit of hindsight, but I think I could say that it was naive at best. And if you had studied the role of the court in the last many decades, you would have been more careful about forecasting that kind of a role.
In fact, let's get into that. So this is, Anuj's core domain. This is quoting the people domain. So Anuj very interestingly writes that the court actually, opposed the executive right till Indira Gandhi, and then Indira Gandhi was so powerful that it just said, if you can't beat him, join him. It sort of became a populist power center of its own, and it sort of adopted this, excuse me, populist garb. And rather than checking the executive, it started competing with the executive to be a populist organ. Have I got that right, Anuj? Do you want to expand on that?
Right, right. No, that's an interesting point because you see, it's important to understand that obviously populism is a word that is used a lot in Indian
Right.
media and Indian parlance, in all kinds of public discourse, and it is used in all kinds of ways. But
Well,
and one could argue, I think inarguably almost that since 1971, language of Indian politics is that of populism. Since Mrs. Gandhi's famous election in 1971, right? I think, and that's probably true about much of South Asia, in fact, not just India. And that's I think most Indian politicians, in the way they function, could be considered to be populist in
and
the kind of
like
global.
because
Yeah.
populism uses a negative term, one of the things that I liked about say Gyan Prakash's history of the emergency is
Yeah.
he also gives like there's a caste angle. There's OBCs are coming into politics. I think you've called
Yeah.
it vernaculization, or you've quoted someone in your book.
Yeah.
There's a vernaculization of Indian politics. Of course, one facet of which is populism, but yeah, there's
Right.
a whole host of changes happening in the 70s.
Right, right. Now, but there's a difference when the code itself becomes populist. You see, I mean, the code was of course, in a sense, what I've tried to argue in the book is that the post-emergency transformation of the code is not just the code suddenly becoming realizing it made a mistake and trying to correct its code, but the code becoming a fundamentally different kind of an institution. Right. The
Right.
court is no longer interested in performing the negative function, like I was saying. The court is actually.
You're basically telling the sort of the standard origin story of the PIL. In a way, it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
a mea
yeah.
culpa to
Right.
the Supreme Court rubber stamping the emergency. So they said, but you disagree with that formulation in a way.
Yeah, yeah,
You think
yeah.
it's more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So that that is a classic idea that they've done a bad thing during the emergency, and now they
Right.
try to do good things through
Right.
PIL and all of that. But I think the transformation is more fundamental than that. The transformation is the court is like I said, no longer interested in the classic normative role at all. It's a very different kind of a court. The court is basically not interested in judicial review, but in judicial populism. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, I think there's like I said, Indian politics is the language in politics is populism. But when the judiciary becomes populist, there are inherent dangers in that, right?
Right.
Firstly, obviously, unlike the other populist politicians who get elected, who have to fight elections, like it or not, they have to, they have a certain basic accountability at a very fundamental level. Obviously, judges do not have that, right? So that is obviously at a very basic level. But there's a more important. I mean, there is a more inherent difficulty. You see, the main constraint, the way in which, you can say that the courts are political, right? And at a fundamental, at a kind of a basic level, that's true that the courts are political, right? Because it's a state institution performing a particular role, right?
Right.
But in performing that political function, as prescribed by the Constitution, right? It has to act in certain manner, right? Famously, one of the famous theorizations of the judiciary, given in the Federalist Papers of the U.S. by the man called Alexander Hamilton, who is having a bit of a revival, was that while the parliament is characterized, the power lies in its purse, that controls the budget. The executive line is sword. The power of the judiciary really it's characterized by judgment, right? Now, what has precisely happened in India is that the decline of that. Now, so the ways in which the court has to act, even if it wants to act politically, is through the language of law, meaning that it has to it has to exercise legal reasoning, what's called public reason, right? And it has to, and its functioning is regulated by norms of procedural justice, right? That there are ways in which the court is supposed to act. It cannot just so there are inherent limitations in the way in which the court is supposed to function. Now, what happens when I say judicial populism? It's precisely that it gives up on all of these norms, right? It gives up on. So basically, if you think classically that the role of judiciary is to check the lawlessness of the executive, or of a
Right.
lawless law. I think what is characterized in judiciary is itself lawlessness. We have a lawless
Right.
judiciary in the sense that the reliance on substantive norms. Basically, the court is acting has started acting in ways that um, goes beyond the legal, whether it be in terms of its legal reasoning, which is often devoid of logic or reason or law, or in terms of the procedure. But that is, of course, and this was self-consciously done, by the way. This was
So
not something
because
that
it's getting completely object oriented, it's going to say that
absolutely,
I'm going
absolutely,
to remove poverty, and
exactly,
how I get
exactly.
to that path is immaterial,
Yeah.
right?
Now, this is particularly to do with what I call the apotheosis of a particular part of the constitution called directive principles. So,
Right.
which Mrs. Gandhi would repeatedly use in the 70s to beat the judiciary with, that you guys all prioritize privilege, this liberal rights, this elitist rights, right? There's this discourse of rights being seen as the main, protecting rights being seen as the function of the judiciary, and
Right.
Mrs. Gandhi repeatedly beating the judiciary with that that pre-occasion rights, as opposed to that of directive principles, which is about the state pursuing ideas of social economic transformation. Now, what happens after the emergency is precisely that the court basically um, accepts Mrs. Gandhi's logic, that and we see particularly in the language of Justice Bhagwati, who is perhaps the most influential judge in this period, and I would say in Indian post-independence Indian um, um,
He's also the father
history.
of the PIL.
Father of PIL,
Right.
person who, many other changes. The right to life expansion was led by him also, for instance.
Right.
So, and this right to life expansion is a very interesting one, because it's the provision actually reads, no person shall be deprived of life or personal liberty except by procedure established by law. Now, what they did, what has happened in the period in the last 4 decades, I argue, is that they've read all kinds of things into life that you cannot be deprived of life, meaning including sleep, for instance, in Baba Ramdev's case, in Ramlila Maidan case. So you cannot be deprived of all of this, but you can be deprived of personal liberty itself, meaning that basically everything except what is literally mentioned in the constitution is part of that right to life. So what I'm trying to say is that Justice Bhagwati actually programmatically read like this, and he was quite explicit about it. That we cannot be privileging all these elitist rights. We have
Right.
to talk about, in the Indian realities, demand that we must privilege. We must give more importance um, state goals of the two directive principles of bringing about equality, etc. And interestingly, if you look at recent judgments from and the most controversial recent judgment in the last few years, including the PMLA of a few days back,
Right.
the Solicitor General tried to defend PMLA again in the language directive principles. The Aadhaar, one of the principal grounds of
Is
upholding the Aadhaar
welfare.
was welfare, of course.
Yeah.
And the directive principle explicitly, actually, it's not hidden. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to say that the court actually changed and also in some ways it's grounded in the text of the constitution, you see. So one of the interesting uh, problems in India, that the problem of unelected judiciary is a global one. This question of crisis of legitimacy of an unelected court, and it is, you're acting against an elected legislature, right? Who gives you the power? Who gives the legitimacy, right? That question of, and this in American, uh, legal parlance, it's called the problem of, the counter majoritarian difficulty, they call it, right? How do you legitimize these unelected judges
Right.
sitting over elected legislators? India is particularly acute that problem because we have this provision, this set of provisions called directive principles. Now, directive principles are, we have all probably read it in school in some version, and we've seen that these
Right.
innocuous, well-meaning provisions.
A
But
5 mark question in every civics paper.
exactly. But
Right.
some of us may not be particularly fond of certain directive principles on prohibition or on culture, but broadly it's seen as
Good thing.
a
Yeah.
good thing, right?
Right.
But it's interesting to think about directive principles um, uh, in the space it occupies in the constitution. What is the rest of the Constitution trying to do? The rest of the Constitution, what is the Constitution trying to do? It's trying to define the sovereignty of a new state through its various organs. Is to divide the sovereignties, to canalize the sovereignty, right? And can limit it in certain ways. What things it can do, how it has to go about it, who will be the authorities, etc. What is directive principles trying to do? It is, on the other hand, giving a kind of a invitation to the state to do certain, to carry out certain noble objectives.
Expanding state power.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And that from 1950 onwards, immediately since Nehru's time, since the First Amendment, since the government of the day has basically argued that why is the judiciary obsessed with the rest of the Constitution? What about directive principles, right? And we are carrying out certain laws, or we are carrying out certain certain acts in order to enhance directive principles. That's what the Constitution has given us the mandate to do. So basically, that counter-majoritarian difficulty in India gets further accentuated by this constitutional anomaly of directive principles. Some people may not like me calling it an anomaly, but basically there's the strangeness of it, which we have normalized. But there is a certain difficulty that has led to, which and since in the 70s, Mrs. Gandhi used it particularly effectively, this language of directive principles during the emergency, and since then, in the kind of the new hegemony that these provisions enjoyed, and this particular language of attacking the judiciary as basically colonial and elitist, etc., was acted upon, and mimicked by Justice Bhagwati in his judgments. I've written as I talk about Justice Bhagwati, what Mrs. Gandhi was to Indian politics, Justice Bhagwati was to Indian judiciary, in terms of Mrs. Gandhi decisively changed the language of Indian politics in India, right? And I think Justice Bhagwati did precisely that with regard to judiciary. And yeah.
One thing that I wanted, so from this Bhagwati thing, I want to just jump off. One very interesting thing, when Bhagwati is just starting off his, remaking of the Indian judiciary, his language is a kind of, vaguely leftist language. I think the court is, trying to meet these socialist goals, which are also largely directive principles. That was the environment that our constitution was framed in. And I think there was a fair bit of support from left liberals. This large, it's a very amorphous, so I don't want to put a exact term to it. But later, as you write, in a way, the PIL then moved. It became this anti-poor tool. And the court itself today, if you look at it, 30, 40 years later, there are strong elements of the right wing in the court. So in a way, was that initial expansion of powers, or at least this change by leftists and liberals, a bit of an unstrategic move, just looking at it from their point of view? Or is it a benefit of hindsight, unfairness that I'm putting on?
No, I think it's definitely not only unstrategic but callous move in my view. You created a Frankenstein. So yeah, at some level, populism is inherently unstable. When Mrs. Gandhi in 1971 fought on the basis of Garibi Hatao, by the time of emergency, it became about population and Nasbandi and such kind of draconian. So populism inherently
started blaming the poor for their poverty eventually, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's how that's the inherent instability of it. But judiciary is usually inoculated against such such trends because of the discipline it's supposed to have, usually. But in India, the judiciary has discarded the discipline decades back, right? So in that sense, of course. But at some level, you see, I don't think that language has gone in India entirely. There's a certain welfareist language, like you said, with Aadhaar cases now, is a few years back, right? That the court is, relying on that to uphold that, that we are trying to provide food, food security, etc. And so that language is not entirely gone. And even then, by the way, directive was always included prohibition and cow slaughter, right? And in fact, people often, I'm quite surprised how people omit that, because in fact, if there are two directive principles which have been weaponized from the word go after the coming of the fourth constitution, these two, because the cow slaughter laws were there in the early 50s, all these, and prohibition, of course, right? Bombay and so much. So, this right-wing agenda was not hidden, at some level, right? It was part of, this is a strange, obviously, Indian left is obviously not, it's obviously a strange mix of of ideas, right? So at some level, prohibition is actually quite popular among much of the Indian left also.
Very
So
much
for
so.
instance,
Very
and
much.
the imposition of cow slaughter, ban on cow slaughter rather, was actually an attempt to think of them in terms of decolonizing, right? When these
Yes,
beef-eating British were there, we could not get rid
we
of.
could not get rid of
But
it.
now we are independent. Now the Bihar legislature and the UP legislature in the early 50s thought that now we can do what we wanted to do, right?
In
So
fact,
so it's
right till the recent 2007 judgment, I think at least legally it's always discussed as an economic issue,
yeah. So it's
right?
of course couched as that, as you're rightly saying.
A couch does that,
Couched as the directive principle, which was made about animal husbandry and scientific forms of
right?
agriculture. But of course now, as we know, that's no longer the case. That the fig leaf is no longer felt to be needed. But
Right,
I'm just saying that the so-called left agenda becoming the right agenda is in many ways, it was always playing with fire, but it was also that it was always a kind of a hybrid mix. It was never kind of ideologically consistent in any
right,
case. And at this point, and it's still not entirely gone. I mean, we know that in politics, whatever rightward shift you may say, it continues to have this, welfarist language. Obviously, all parties profess it. Almost all parties profess it, I would say. And there's no
right.
libertarians in Indian politics. So yeah,
Actually, there are, yeah, that's
there are.
true.
But
I
yeah,
think everybody's, at least officially on paper is a welfare is big state guy, right? Uh, in fact, I want to so this question of the big state. One of there's a very interesting series of lectures by this former UK Supreme Court judge called I'm just going to call him Mr. Sumption, but actually his title is Lord Sumption. Uh, so Sumption has this very interesting thesis that I would actually it's part of a lecture series called the Wreath Lectures. I would kind of recommend it generally the lecture series, but specifically his lectures because he sort of takes a bit of a hammer to this idea, which is very prevalent in the West and maybe is even in India, that expansion of the law per se is a good thing. I mean, there might be a bit few hitches here and there, but as long as you legalize something, that's a good thing. And he sort of puts a pin in that. And one of his very interesting examples actually is abortion. Like he says that abortion was politically fought out in Europe. It was legislated on, and hence it has actually deeper roots as an idea compared to in the US, where it was a judicial pronouncement. So it was never properly fought out in the political sphere. And of course, he actually gave the lectures a few years back. It's quite prescient today now when actually Roe v. Wade has been overturned. Actually, so suddenly with if you can convince like I don't know 9 judges, you can take away human rights at a vast scale in a way.
Mhm.
Is this a tendency in India too? Is there a tendency to hyper legalize, to take everything to the Supreme Court, to make every social political issue into a legal issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Shoaib. And I would say that two parts to it. One is the judicializing every issue, but the other is also legalizing every issue in terms of trying to legislate on every issue. Both
Right.
aspects need to be talked
Good
about.
point.
But
Right.
but on the abortion issue, it's quite interesting to speak about in the day after the referendum in Kansas. Where there was a referendum on whether um, the constitution of Kansas, which actually bars any which basically uh, bars any criminalization of abortion,
Right.
was and Kansas is of course a Republican state, as it has been for decades. Um,
Right.
Basically, in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, the Republican leaders tried to introduce this amendment through a kind of referendum, um, on whether on the need to criminalize abortion, just like many other red states.
Right.
And it was defeated squarely. It was, I mean, this is a
Wow.
kind of a political earthquake in the U.S. because people are realizing that Roe v. Wade reversal doubles may actually benefit the Democrats much more because actually criminalizing abortion is a very unpopular idea in many red
So
states
in a
too.
red state like Kansas, the
Yeah.
right to abortion has popular support.
Absolutely,
He
absolutely,
just doesn't
and
have
many
to
other states.
support the Supreme Court of the United States. That's all, right?
Yeah, and people thought it may be a narrow victory for the Democrats in that,
Right.
or maybe, but it
Fascinating.
actually they won it. They won it by 15%. So that's massive.
Wow.
So this is a very interesting point what you're raising, and it's been seen in the last couple of years in Ireland and Argentina, two deeply Catholic states and historically
Right.
Catholic states which have decriminalized abortion. As far as I know, I think both of them have. Uh, Decriminalize abortion, and again through referenda, not through judicial pronouncements. So it's an
Right.
interesting point that perhaps if the abortion battles in the US, had gone through, popular, you know, uh, through popular mobilization, as it was, by the way, in the late 60s, early 70s. But then
Right.
it was at some level. I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I know, that there was a move towards decriminalizing abortion in many states, but somehow it was short circuited by this national level, um, judgment that suddenly Roe v. Wade imposed it, and it became it's a inherently judgments of this kind of a top down form. I mean, whatever you may think in certain instances, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also, I'm again no expert in US politics, but I think it's also to understand the importance of going state by state, right? You have to fight those battles in Alabama and Kansas, and not just in
Yeah.
California and New York. That so
Exactly.
that so so
It has
so
to
I
be a
think that's
ground up kind of thing. Like,
absolutely, rather than a top, and with judges, with judgments inherently are at some level, right? So obviously it's easier said than done. Obviously Roe v. Wade has, the reversal of Roe v. Wade in Dobbs obviously has devastating consequences for the mid
right.
for the immediate aftermath, but in the long term may actually be not necessarily. But anyway, we'll see about that.
Right.
But
We'll see about
but I think the larger point, in the Indian context, of what I was saying about the tendency to legalize social issues, political issues through legislations or through judgments. Now, on the question of going the legislative route, there's been a lot of writing, not recently, but in the 90s and in the last decade prior to, the noughties, there was work written by particularly well-known feminist scholar Flavia Agnes and Nivedita Menon, who basically criticized this move in the women's movement to immediately try to to get a legislation to kind of solve the various patriarchal social
I think it
problems as
especially was for child marriage.
child marriage, the many
The
and
fact that
dowry,
child marriage was
yeah,
criminalized, right? For dowry, right?
sati, and of course the most well known perhaps is the rape reforms and what it led to,
Right.
right? And now recently I read Rukmini S, the well known journalist, writing about 2013 amendments, the post Nirbhaya rape amendment being counterproductive for the women's movement.
Very
Interestingly,
interesting.
so this is an interesting kind of a quandary. This attempt to legislate away social problems. Now, of course, there's nothing undemocratic about that inherently. You're going to the elected legislature and asking them to legislate, and
Right.
you're able to do that through specific mobilizations at specific times. But this turn to law has often consequences which are unpredictable, counterproductive.
At the
And
very
one has to
least,
be,
it's much more complex than I think it's
yeah,
talked about. People think that the
yeah,
legislation being passed is the end of the story,
yeah,
but
yeah,
actually,
yeah,
it's the beginning of a
yeah.
story very often, right?
And often people forget, the most important interpreters of the law in India are the police.
Right.
And how is that cop in that going to interpret your fancy new law? That is something that people need to really think about. So maybe, I'm again, benefit of hindsight perhaps you could say, but I think people have to be very careful when they demand reforms, because they can,
Right.
anyway, that is one aspect of it. The second is um, the judicialization. And that is, of course, that's particularly been an acute problem in India. The last, the tendency in India, problem is my view, maybe others may not think of it. A tendency in India since the 80s of basically going to court and saying that here is a social problem and please solve it. And this can be all kinds of social problems. It was initially led by the more left tendencies. Now it's now
Also,
it's all equal opportunity. So almost any issue in India that you can think of um, has takes the judicial route. So I mean, the most extreme probably being the environmental movement, because somehow the rise of the environmental movement happened at the same time as the rise of PIL. So every aspect So when you study environmental law in India, it's basically a bunch of PIs. So it's a very particularly strange and extreme situation with regard to that. But in general, that is a problem. If you want to on any aspect, you can't think of any aspect in India where immediately you can go to court and you think that court obviously is at some level a blunt instrument. They're sitting there, and obviously it's a top-down. It's going to be top-down form, and it's going to hear. I mean, and that of course, I mean, it follows the problems that it leads to. Something I've written about
I mean, I think courts are inherently bad organs to make policy because executives have these, they have firstly they're linked to the people through politicians. They have vast bureaucracies, right? Courts, I mean, it's just one brave guy, right?
I mean, in the very commonsensical, the feedback mechanism of politicians, whatever they are, is very strong. They know that there are certain costs to doing certain things, right? If you are going to change the fuel of auto rickshaws, the most notorious of such or celebrated of such instances, dramatically in like 2 years, you're going to move from one fuel to another. What is going to happen in the short term to public transport? In the long term, also, Delhi still has a less number of buses now than it had in 1998. In actual numbers, the population may have doubled or something, but the number of the buses is actually in numerical terms lesser, and that has been the price that the city has had to pay. So I'm just saying that these are. It may, let's assume that they mean that they had the best of intentions. Let's assume that the judges were trying to do good, right? But obviously, these are what they call polycentric issues. There are many aspects to this issue, and obviously, in the judicial mechanism is inherently limited, that it cannot hear many affected parties, and that inherent limitation is exacerbated by the way that our courts function, where they move and they think they're omniscient and they think they can.
And on the other hand, this is literally the job of politics to balance.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's what it's made for.
Exactly. Right. If Sheila Dixit did not want to do this, there were reasons behind she did not want to do this. Right? If she wanted to do it, she would good. I mean, I'm just saying that politicians have whatever you may think of Indian politicians, they have their own feedback mechanism. They may decide to do some things for certain reasons. The judges are just not capable of that. And sure, there are certain aspects once they are. I'm not saying there should not be turned to the judiciary in certain instances. Obviously, there are certain matters. Once you have, that there are ways in which it can be can be adjudicated, but there are dangers to it, and Indian activists, again across left, right, whatever, have been particularly almost. Been flippant about it, been callous about it in ways which has had devastating consequences to their own causes very often. So
I'm gonna final question. I'm going to yank you back to the present. This for the last few weeks, maybe months, judges have really complained about media criticism. Right? There've been a series of judge lectures. Now, I'm not really sure whether judges always give so many lectures, or we're suddenly covering them. But there has been a lot of coverage of lectures given by judges. And one of the frequent complaints that they made is that there is a lot of media criticism, social media criticism. I mean, of course, I don't agree with them that there shouldn't be criticism. But I have a feeling that just from my personal experience, that there is now a lot more criticism of judges. In fact, when I read your book, I remember it standing out saying that this is one of the few critiques of a beloved. You went in and criticized Santa Claus almost. So you, right? You criticized the PIL, like I mean this. So I was like, okay, so it stood out in many ways for that. I think a lot more people now are doing maybe what you did earlier and critiquing the judges. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. But do you think this trend is true, that there's more criticism of judges? And if it is, why?
Yeah, I think, firstly, I have to say that I think of more myself as that little boy who said the emperor is wearing no clothes. So that, everybody was somehow going along with that. But but yeah, I think one of the positive, developments in the last few years has been there's a kind of a culture of criticism around legal activity, which is around the court, which is I think unqualified good, whatever the future of the court is. Firstly, I have to say that the Indian judges have been getting a lot of attention for a very long time. An American scholar who worked in India for a while, Nick Robinson, wrote about how he was just doing some kind of a study of how often Times of India or other major newspapers report about Indian Parliament. This is
Right.
about 10 years back, and how often they report about the Indian Supreme Court. And it was very clear that the Supreme Court is way more getting much more attention from the
Wow.
from at least the mainstream English media. I mean, news media. I mean, print media. Then this is a while back, right? This is I think at least 10 years back.
I think as a news person, I would say that's true even now.
Yeah.
Honestly.
So
I mean, off the top of my head, right?
And I think in that case, I think what has perhaps changed that he said even more than the prime minister. I think that part has probably changed now. That the judiciary part doesn't get more than the prime minister. But I'm not sure, I don't remember it exactly, but certainly more than the parliament. But perhaps yeah. So it has been getting attention for a while. Now, what has happened in the last few years has been a kind of a media explosion on qualitative coverage of the courts, particularly led by organizations like Live Law and Bar and Bench, and live tweeting, especially that they've done systematically, is kind of a complete game changer, because this opaque institution called the court, from which you would hear snippets of in the news, it would be covered in the newspapers, but the newspapers can cover it in a very, inherently they have to cover it in a very limited manner. They can only do it, in terms of but the kind of wall-to-wall coverage that you see now, the kind of comprehensiveness with which they cover it, and the kind of speed with which they cover it, has meant that that we are exposed to what's going on in the court, in a much more comprehensive manner, in a much more accessible manner than ever before, right? So I think so part of that, this is unqualified good in my view, but but also the number of blogs, the number of writing, which has, it's kind of spun off because of the coverage also partly, and obviously there's been a general expansion in media in general, and somehow perhaps certain kinds of media are particularly well suited for certain kinds of institutions to cover, and visual media have inherent limitations when you don't have live coverage, or it's boring to hear a talking head. Though of course, that's another aspect which we need, perhaps is aspect that for a long time now, this so-called debates on Indian TV news has had lawyers. You would never in any other country see the number of lawyers you see on TV news that you see in India. Literally, and almost every channel has their own favorites, of course. But it's remarkable how many lawyers. Sometimes, of course, they would wearing their whites, and it's there's a phenomenon called TV lawyers now, Twitter lawyers now. That has happened now. And it's partly obviously the importance of the institution that it acquired in the last many decades, So I think, but I think the culture of criticism is really important. What has happened, and partly, of course, it's the excesses of the court in the last few years that it's been particularly extreme in many ways, that has led to this. But I think this, in the court's own words, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think the more exposure we get to the court's functioning, I think, you see, Indians are cynical about in many ways about much of our politics, much of our institutions, much of the media. But somehow, bizarrely enough, they were not so cynical about the judiciary or some parts of the judiciary, right? And that I think has been.
But do you think that's changed?
I think that has changed, and that's not a bad thing. To some extent, obviously, it's a.
To fill the viewers in on this, Anuj's book, again, quoting, has a very fascinating dynamic, which I find very fascinating. Indians personally would hate going to a court, and they think the lower judiciary, especially, is very corrupt and this. But generally, till now, there was a great regard for the higher judiciary, almost in the abstract. Yeah. But you're saying now, with so much of media coverage, that maybe the needle is shifting a bit.
Little bit, I think, to some extent. Obviously, I'm not. It's difficult to say. I'm just speculating. I have no data to back me up. But I think.
Just for my thing, also, I agree with you. I find this hallowed regard for the court, I think, is a bit more difficult, both on the left and the right. Honestly, it's a bipartisan movement in some ways.
Yeah. I think the proliferation uh, of 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 critical writings in general is a good thing. And also, what has happened is that when the court starts to function less and less like a court, like then
Right.
obviously it's that respect that comes from it being at least like you may disagree with the judgment, but you can say that at least it was. But increasingly, that's not the case. Increasingly, judges do not write do not write judgments in the language of law. They do not follow their own norms. So, whether they blatantly violate constitutional norms in provisions when giving judgments, they perform. I mean, they start long judgments with WhatsApp forwards. I mean, what do you say about this? So obviously
Or get elected to the Rajya Sabha.
they get elected to Rajya Sabha. So so the ways in which they've been functioning as the judiciary functions less and less like a judiciary, as it gives up a judicial function in more and more stark ways. Obviously, criticism is going to come, and the cynicism that we have about every other institution, which I mean, at some level, to some extent, I think cynicism was required about the judiciary. There's far too much wide-eyed, kind of view about the courts in, let's say, about 10 years back. And I think it needed to be rectified. It didn't have to go this far, perhaps, but the court has kind of forced our hand. But on the other point that you made, and it's about this schizophrenic view that Indians have about lower judiciary and higher judiciary. Lower judiciary is like completely pathological through and through. Jolly LLB, right? That is our view of
I mean,
trial courts.
Indians would literally go to gangsters than go to
Yeah,
a court in some cases, right? Like,
yeah. So this
right?
kind of while there's one view of the lower judiciary, तो मतलब it's there's no hope. And on the other hand, the higher judiciary is like the fountain of hope. It's like panacea for everything.
Right.
Anything you take to court, they will solve it. That was the idea, right? And I think well, that has been somewhat rectified. But I mean, the analogy I would give is that the lower courts were like train stations. Dirty, in terms of, and no security. That's one other aspect of Indians are like they're accessible in that sense of full of it felt like it was excessively embedded in the Indian social, just like railway stations, and
Right.
high judiciary like airports, that shining spaces, difficult to go get into, very, very expensive to access, and somehow and completely disembedded from the Indian social. At least it was till a few years back. So
Anuj, I'm
so
going to
that
stop you there. We're completely out of time. This is a fascinating point, and we can really, I think, discuss this for the next couple of hours. But we'll hopefully have you on again on the show because I think there's a lot to discuss about the judiciary. But I'm going to stop the show here. It was a fascinating show, Anuj. Thank you so much for coming on.
thank you, Shoaib. It was a pleasure as usual to talk to you.
Pleasure. Anuj's book is called Quoting the People, and give it a read. That's all we have for the 7th episode of Scroll Ideas. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.